She woke up on a train depot bench in Wyoming with a gun pressed against her temple. The man she'd traveled 12 days to marry was already in the ground, dead 3 days before she arrived. No money, no family, no way home. And somewhere back in Boston, a man with dead eyes was already hunting her, because she'd watched him strangle someone in her father's study. Clara was ready to walk into the snow and let the cold take her. Then a stranger appeared. He didn't speak, not a single word. He handed her warm bread, hot coffee, and a coat that somehow fit her when nothing in her life ever had. He wrote 2 words on a scrap of paper. "Come with me." She didn't know he was once the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories. She didn't know they called him the Silent Death, and she didn't know he'd stopped speaking 5 years ago, because the last words he ever said weren't enough to stop his wife from pulling the trigger while he watched. Welcome to Cowboy Horizon, where the frontier speaks through stories of shattered hearts, desperate courage, and the kind of love that only grows where the land is wild and the odds are impossible. This story teaches us that the people who see us at our lowest and stay are the ones worth building a life with, and that finding your voice again starts with finding someone worth speaking for. If this story left a mark on you, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what would you have done on that bench? Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose to live, and subscribe to Cowboy Horizon with notifications on so you're always here when the next story begins. Some folks come west looking for gold. Others come chasing land or freedom or a fresh start where nobody knows their name. But Clara Hale came west because she had nowhere else left to go. And sometimes that kind of desperate is the only thing that saves you. She woke to the cold barrel of a gun pressed against her temple. Her eyes flew open. A man wearing a deputy's star stood over her in the gray light of dawn. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he spoke. His voice carried that particular brand of suspicion lawmen reserved for strangers and drifters. "Who are you? And why do you got a photograph of a dead man in your bag?" Clara pushed herself upright on the depot bench. Her whole body ached from sleeping on wooden slats. Frost had formed on her thin wool coat overnight, and her fingers were so numb she could barely feel them. The cold had seeped into her bones during the long, dark hours. She had dreamed of warmth, of fireplaces and hot coffee and arms wrapped around her. She had woken to a gun in her face. "I am Clara Hale." She kept her voice steady despite the weapon aimed at her skull. "I came to marry Samuel Thornton. He was supposed to meet me here yesterday." The deputy sheriff studied her face with narrowed eyes. Something flickered in his expression, something he was not saying. His gaze traveled down her frame in that way she had grown accustomed to over 26 years of living, taking in her size, her worn dress with its patched elbows and frayed hem. The carpet bag clutched between her frozen feet like it contained everything she had left in this world. It did. She knew that look. Had been receiving it her whole life from men and women alike. The look that said she took up too much space, that she was too tall and too solid and too much of everything a woman was not supposed to be. "Thornton, you say?" The deputy repeated the name like he was testing how it tasted in his mouth. "Yes, sir. We corresponded for 6 months through letters. He sent train fare, $3.40. We had an arrangement, a proper one." The deputy lowered his weapon but did not holster it. His thumb rested on the hammer. "Ready. Maybe you ought to ask around town before you wait any longer." He tipped his hat in a gesture that held no warmth. "Ma-am." Then he was gone, walking with purpose toward the nicest hotel in town. A 3-story building with a painted sign that read, Grand Hotel. Clara watched him glance up at a second-floor window before disappearing around the corner. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut, the way animals feel storms coming. The deputy knew something about Samuel Thornton, something he was not telling her. She stood on legs stiff from cold and gathered her bag. The depot master had made clear she could not stay on his bench forever. He had said as much 3 times during the night, each time less polite than the last. But where else could she go? Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and counted what remained of the money she had stolen from her father's safe back in Boston. 12 cents. 12 cents in a carpet bag and the clothes on her back, and nothing else in this vast, empty territory that stretched toward mountains she did not know the names of. The main street of Bitter Creek stretched before her in the pale morning light. Wooden buildings lined both sides. A general store with barrels of flour and salt piled on the porch. A saloon with rooms above it. A land office with a faded sign. A livery stable where horses stamped and snorted in the cold. A church steeple rising white against the gray sky in the distance. Maybe 200 souls lived here. Maybe less. Clara walked toward the saloon. Not because she wanted whiskey at 7 in the morning. Lord knew she had never touched spirits in her life. But because the sign hanging crooked above the door said boarding and meals. And because lamplight glowed warm through the windows while everything else in this godforsaken town looked cold and dead and unwelcoming. Her boots crunched on frozen mud as she crossed the street. A wagon rolled past. The driver did not look at her. Nobody looked at her. She was already invisible, already forgotten. Just another stranger passing through on her way to nowhere. She pushed through the saloon door. The smell hit her first. Wood smoke and coffee and something cooking. Bacon, maybe. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. A piece of hard bread and a sliver of cheese she had been saving for the journey. A woman stood behind the bar polishing glasses with a rag that had seen better days. Red hair going silver at the temples. Strong arms that spoke of years hauling crates and throwing out troublemakers who did not know when to quit. Sharp eyes that saw everything and forgot nothing. The woman looked up, looked Clara over from head to toe. Something shifted in her expression. Not judgment, not pity. Something closer to recognition. Like she was seeing a version of herself from long ago. "You must be the one who'd been sleeping on that bench all night." Clara nodded. Her throat felt tight. "I am looking for Samuel Thornton. Do you know him?" The woman set down the glass she had been polishing. Her face changed in a way that made Clara's stomach drop. The kind of change that comes before bad news. The kind of change she had seen on the doctor's face when her mother was dying. "Honey." The woman came around the bar slowly, like she was approaching a wounded animal. "You do not know." "Know what?" "Samuel Thornton died 3 days ago. Horse threw him out on the North Ridge, broke his neck clean. They buried him yesterday morning in the churchyard. I am sorry, darling. I truly am." The words landed like stones. Clara felt them settle in her chest, in her stomach, in all the soft places where hope had been hiding since she fled Boston with nothing but a carpet bag and a dream of disappearing. But it was not grief she felt. She had never met Samuel Thornton, had only known him through letters written in careful script, letters that spoke of a small ranch and honest work and the need for a wife who was not afraid of hardship. What she felt was fear, pure cold fear that wrapped around her heart and squeezed. Without Thornton, she had no cover, no identity, no reason to be in this town, no way to disappear into the vast anonymity of the frontier. Victor would find her now. It was only a matter of time. "I am sorry, darling." The woman touched Clara's arm with rough, gentle fingers. "Name is Maggie. Maggie O'Brien. I got rooms upstairs if you need a place to stay. Nothing fancy, but the beds are clean and I change the sheets regular. I cannot pay." Clara hated how small her voice sounded, how defeated. "We can figure something out." Maggie's eyes were kind but practical, the eyes of a woman who had survived hard times and harder men. "You got skills. Can you cook, clean, sew?" "Yes, all of those. My mother taught me before she passed." "Then we will work it out. Come on, let me get you some coffee and some breakfast. You look half frozen to death." Clara wanted to accept. God, how she wanted to accept. Wanted to collapse into this woman's kindness and let someone else solve her problems for once in her miserable life. But she could not bring that danger here, could not put a stranger at risk just because she was desperate. Victor Harrington was looking for her, the man she had been promised to since birth through an arrangement between their fathers. The man who had strangled his business rival in her father's study 3 months ago while she watched through the gap in the door. She had not meant to see, had been passing by on her way to fetch a book, but she had seen, had watched Victor's hands close around Mr. Patterson's throat, had watched the life drain from the man's eyes while Victor smiled, that terrible calm smile. Afterward, Victor had found her trembling in the hallway. "You will marry me next month as planned, Clara. And if you ever speak of what you saw, I will make sure no one ever finds your body. Do you understand me?" She had understood, had nodded with tears streaming down her face, had smiled and pretended everything was fine for 2 weeks while she planned her escape. Then she had stolen money from her father's safe, found a mail-order bride advertisement in a penny paper, written to Samuel Thornton using a false name, bought a train ticket west. And now she was sitting in a saloon in Wyoming territory with 12 cents and no future, and a murdered man's sister probably wondering why his fiancée never showed up for the wedding. "Thank you kindly," Clara said to Maggie, "but I need to think. I will come back directly." She left before the woman could argue, walked back to the depot bench because she had nowhere else to go, sat down on the cold wood and stared at the mountains rising purple against the pale sky. Samuel Thornton was dead. Her last chance at escape was buried in frozen ground somewhere in a churchyard she had never seen. Clara watched the town wake up around her as the morning wore on. A wagon rattled past loaded with hay. The general store opened its doors. A woman emerged from a house across the street, saw Clara sitting on the bench, and hurried her daughter inside without making eye contact. Like desperation was catching. Like poverty was a disease that spread through looking. The abandoned bride. That is what they saw. A desperate woman, too large and too loud and too much of everything, who had been found wanting by a man who died rather than marry her. That is the story they were already telling themselves. She had been found wanting her entire life. By midday, hunger clawed at her stomach like a living thing. She had eaten the last of her bread yesterday evening, certain that by nightfall she would be sitting down to supper in a warm kitchen with the man who had promised to be her husband. The man who would give her a new name and a new life and freedom from Victor Harrington's dead eyes and cold hands. By late afternoon, she had accepted the truth. The sun was sinking toward the mountains and the temperature was dropping fast. If she stayed on this bench, she would freeze to death before morning. If she left, she had nowhere to go. Either way, the ending was the same. That was when she saw him. A man loading supplies into a wagon across the street. Tall. Taller than most men she had seen. Broad-shouldered and built solid like someone who had worked hard labor his entire life. He moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who knew exactly what his body could do, and had tested those limits more than once. A scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, thick and white against weathered skin, the kind of scar that came from a knife, not an accident. His eyes were gray, storm gray, the color of winter sky before snow. He stopped what he was doing, turned, looked directly at her, not with pity, not with contempt, not with the measuring gaze of men deciding if she was worth their time or their money or their attention. He looked at her the way a predator assesses another predator, trying to determine what she was, what kind of threat she might pose, what she was capable of. Clara looked away first. Her heart was pounding for reasons she did not understand. When she looked back, he was gone. The wagon sat half-loaded, but the man had vanished like smoke. Time passed. The sun sank lower. The shadows grew longer. The temperature dropped until she could see her breath fogging in the air. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter and accepted what she had known since morning. This was how her story ended. Not with Victor's hands around her throat back in Boston, but with cold and hunger and the slow surrender of someone who had simply run out of road. Then he was there, standing in front of her bench like he had materialized from the twilight itself, holding a bundle wrapped in brown paper in one hand, a tin cup steaming in the other, a heavy wool coat draped over his arm. He set the food beside her on the bench, bread still warm from the oven, cheese and dried meat, enough to fill the hollow ache in her stomach. He set the coffee in her frozen hands. The heat seeped through the tin into her numb fingers. She nearly wept at the feeling. He draped the coat over her shoulders without asking permission. It smelled of wood smoke and sage and leather. It smelled like the frontier itself, wild and vast and free. It fit her. She had expected it to be too small. Men's coats were always too small for her. Her shoulders were too broad. Her arms were too long. She had spent her whole life trying to fit into spaces that were not built for her body. But this coat fit. I do not understand. Her voice cracked with emotion she could not name. What do you want from me? He did not answer, did not speak at all. Instead, he pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket. A stub of pencil worn down to almost nothing. He wrote 2 words in careful, unpracticed script, the letters shaky like a man who did not write often. He handed the paper to her. Come with me. Clara stared at the note, at the coat warming her shoulders, at this silent, scarred man who had appeared from nowhere and offered her everything she needed without asking anything in return. Where? He gestured vaguely. North, toward the mountains that rose dark against the fading sky. Why? He did not answer, just waited, patient as stone, patient as the mountains themselves. Clara looked at the bench that had been her home for 2 days, at the town that had already forgotten her, at the 12 cents that would not save her from anything. She looked at this stranger who had fed her without asking questions, who had seen her sitting here all day being ignored by everyone else and had done something about it. Maybe he was dangerous. Maybe this was worse than freezing. Maybe she was trading one kind of death for another. But staying here was certain death, and he had given her his coat. I do not know who you are. She stood on legs that trembled from cold and weakness, and something that might have been hope. But I have nowhere else to go. He nodded once, turned and walked toward his wagon. Clara gathered her carpet bag and followed. She did not look back. From the second-floor window of the Grand Hotel Dalton, Vance watched the wagon roll out of town. His man stood beside him, a hired gun named Reeves who had ridden with Vance for 3 years. That is McAllister, the one you've been watching. Vance smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Nothing ever reached his eyes. They were cold and flat, like a snake's. 5 years I have waited for him to care about something again. 5 years. He lit a cigar, drew the smoke deep into his lungs, let it out slow. Send word to our friend in Boston. Tell him his missing bride is in Bitter Creek, Wyoming. And tell him I would like to discuss a partnership. The house needed someone strong enough to face the ghosts living inside it. Clara understood that the moment she crossed the threshold. They had ridden for 2 hours through gathering darkness, the wagon cresting ridges and dipping into valleys she could barely see, the mountains growing closer with every mile, the town disappearing behind them until it was nothing but a memory of lamplight in the distance. The man beside her had not spoken a single word, had not written another note. He simply drove the wagon with steady hands while Clara huddled in his coat and watched the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. She had never seen so many stars. Back in Boston, the city lights drowned them out. Here they stretched from horizon to horizon like scattered diamonds on black velvet, like God had spilled a bucket of light across the heavens. When the ranch appeared, Clara thought she had imagined it. One moment there was nothing but shadow and starlight and the dark bulk of mountains. The next there was a house, a barn, fence lines stretching into darkness like the bones of some great creature. Evan stopped the wagon beside the barn. She had learned his name from a faded sign on the gate they had passed through. Silent Creek Ranch, E. McAllister. The letters were old and weathered, but still readable. He gestured toward the house. Clara hesitated. The windows were dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. The place looked abandoned. Haunted, maybe? He gestured again. Firmer this time, his meaning clear. Go inside. He would tend the horses first. She climbed down from the wagon. Her legs nearly buckled after sitting so long in the cold. She steadied herself against the wheel and gathered her carpetbag and walked toward the house that would become her home. The front door was unlocked. Clara pushed it open and stepped into darkness that smelled of cold ash and dust and something else. Coffee, maybe. Or the ghost of meals cooked long ago by hands that no longer moved. She found matches on a shelf near the door, struck one against the rough wood, lit a lamp that sat on a table covered in a thin layer of dust. Light bloomed across the room. The main room was sparse but clean beneath the dust. Someone had cared for this place once. Someone had made it a home. Now it sat waiting for that someone to return. Stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold but laid with kindling like the owner expected to be back any moment. Table with 2 chairs pushed against the opposite wall. Rocking chair near the hearth worn smooth by years of use. Shelves holding tin plates and cups and a few books with cracked spines. A clock on the mantel that had stopped at 3:17. Morning or afternoon, she could not tell. On the mantel beside the clock, a photograph had been turned face down. The dust around it showed where the frame had once stood upright, as if even her image had become too painful to see. Clara knew she should not look, should respect the privacy of this silent man who had saved her life. But curiosity had always been her weakness, the thing that got her into trouble more often than not. She turned the photograph over. A young woman looked back at her. Pretty in a delicate way. Dark hair pinned up in the fashion of 5 or 6 years ago, standing beside a younger version of the scarred man who had brought Clara here. Both solemn in the way people got when sitting for photographs, but connected somehow. His hand on her shoulder, her hand covering his. Love visible in the small space between their bodies. His wife. Dead wife, most likely. That explained the emptiness that hung over this place like a shroud. That explained why a man who could save a stranger's life could not bring himself to speak. Clara set the photograph back face down. Some secrets were not hers to uncover. Some grief was too private to witness. She explored further. Found a desk pushed against the wall beneath a window gone dark with night. A drawer that stuck when she pulled it. She pulled harder. Inside lay a revolver, well-oiled and loaded, ready for use at any moment. A tarnished star beside it. The word Bounty Hunter barely visible on the metal. And a list of names written in careful script. Every single one crossed out in dark red ink that might have been blood. Clara stared at the list, at the star, at the gun. 47 names, 47 men. 12 of them crossed out twice. Dead, maybe. Killed, maybe. By the hand of the man who had just saved her life. Who was this man who had brought her into his home? What kind of monster had she followed into the wilderness? The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Clara slammed the drawer shut, but she was too slow. He had seen. Their eyes met across the room. Storm gray meeting sea green. He knew she had found something. Knew she had been looking where she should not have looked. For a long moment, neither moved. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She waited for anger, for violence, for the price of knowing too much about a man who killed for money. Instead, he walked to the desk with steady steps, opened the drawer she had just closed, removed the star and the list and the gun, with hands that did not shake. Put them in a lockbox under the desk and turned the key. The click of the lock was loud in the silence. Clara found her voice somewhere in the tightness of her throat. I have secrets too. Things I am running from. Things I have done and things that were done to me. I will not judge yours if you do not judge mine. He pulled out his paper, his pencil, wrote slowly in that unpracticed hand. Do not ask, do not need to know. Fine. Then do not ask about mine. Fair enough. He looked at her, those storm-gray eyes unreadable as the night sky outside. Then he nodded once. Agreement made. He built a fire in the cold hearth, showed her the small bedroom off the main room where she could sleep. Clean sheets on a thin mattress. More than she deserved after everything she had done to survive. That night, Clara lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Wind against the windows, horses shifting in the barn, the creak of the rocking chair in the main room where Evan sat watching the fire die. Through the wall, she could hear him moving, the sound of a man who could not sleep, a man whose ghosts kept him company through the long hours of the night. Neither of them slept until nearly dawn. She wondered what ghost he was watching for. She wondered if they were anything like the ones that haunted her dreams. Victor's face, Victor's hands, Victor's voice, promising to make her disappear if she ever told anyone what she had seen. Before she finally drifted off, she noticed something. The coat he had given her hung on the bedpost where she had placed it. She had assumed it would be too small, like everything else in her life had been too small. Men's clothes, women's expectations, the narrow boxes the world tried to force her into. But this coat fit. She did not know what that meant, but she noticed. The next morning, he wrote out his offer on a fresh sheet of paper. Work in exchange for room and board. Help with the house and the ranch. Small wage when he could afford it. Nothing improper expected or wanted. Clara read it twice. Fair terms. More than fair for a woman with no options and no future and 12 cents to her name. I need to learn to shoot. The words came out before she could stop them, before she could think better of asking a bounty hunter to teach her to kill. His pencil stopped moving. He looked up at her with those unreadable eyes. Someone is looking for me. She met his gaze without flinching. I need to be able to defend myself when he finds me. And he will find me. Men like him always do. A long pause. He studied her face like he was reading something written there. Something only he could see. She braced herself for questions, for demands to know who and why and what had she done. For the inevitable moment when he decided she was too much trouble and sent her back to town to freeze or starve or wait for Victor to come collect her. He wrote 2 words. I will teach you. Something loosened in Clara's chest. A knot she had been carrying since Boston. He had not asked why. Had not questioned her need or her motives. Had just accepted that she knew what she needed and offered to help her get it. It was the first time she could remember being taken seriously. She learned to shoot the way she had learned everything else in her life. By failing until she could not fail anymore. 2 weeks into her stay, Evan set up targets behind the ranch house. Tin cans on fence posts. A wooden board with a circle drawn in charcoal. Empty whiskey bottles lined up on a fallen log. He handed her a Colt revolver. The weight of it surprised her, and she nearly dropped it, nearly sent it clattering to the frozen ground. Heavy, she said, heavier than she expected. He took it back, opened the cylinder, and loaded 6 rounds one by one, the brass casings catching the morning light. He snapped the cylinder closed and returned it to her hands. Heavier now. He wrote on his ever-present paper. Lives are in there, Clara understood. This was not a game. This was not sport shooting at a gentleman's club back east. This was life and death distilled into metal and gunpowder, and the space between one heartbeat and the next. He moved behind her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather and something else, something that was just him. He adjusted her stance with careful hands, his palms on her shoulders, her hips, positioning her feet wider apart. She flinched when he touched her waist. Instinct born from a lifetime of expecting hands to recoil in disgust, of hearing her mother's voice reminding her to take smaller portions, of watching men's eyes slide past her to prettier, smaller women who took up less space in the world. He did not pull away, did not react to her size at all. His hands stayed steady on her hips like he was positioning a rifle or adjusting a saddle. Practical, purposeful, without judgment. He wrote on his paper, "Wider stance. You need stable base. You have one. Use it." Clara stared at the words. Read them again. He had taken the thing she hated most about herself, her size, her weight, her solidness, and turned it into an advantage. She faced the target, a tin can sitting on a fence post 20 feet away. She steadied her breathing the way he had shown her, raised the gun, sighted down the barrel, pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. The can did not move. The recoil jolted through her arms and into her shoulders. Again, he wrote. She fired again. Missed by less this time, but still missed. Again. 20 shots. 30. 40. Her hands ached. Her shoulders burned, her ears rang from the constant thunder of gunfire. He did not let up, did not tell her to rest, did not suggest she was not strong enough or capable enough or good enough. On the 32nd shot, she clipped a can. It spun off the fence post and fell into the dirt. Evan nodded once, wrote, "Tomorrow, sunrise, same again." They fell into a rhythm after that. Mornings were for shooting. Hour after hour of loading and aiming and firing until her hands moved without thinking, until the gun became an extension of her arm. Afternoons were for ranch work, feeding the horses and the chickens and the 2 milk cows that provided butter and cheese, mending fences that had fallen into disrepair during the years Evan had been alone, chopping wood for the fire that burned day and night against the Wyoming cold. Clara discovered muscles she did not know she had, discovered a strength in her body that years of Boston society had taught her to hide. Out here, that strength was useful, necessary even. Out here, she could swing an axe and haul water and lift fence posts without anyone telling her it was unladylike. Out here, she could be herself. Evenings were for quiet meals at the table where they communicated through notes and glances, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped expecting words to solve anything. He would write questions about the ranch work. She would write answers. Sometimes they would sit for an hour without exchanging a single word, and it felt more like conversation than anything she'd experienced in Boston's crowded ballrooms. One night, 3 weeks into her stay, Clara pushed past the comfortable silence. "Why do you not speak? Is it that you cannot?" Evan went still. The question hung between them like smoke, like something dangerous that might catch fire if handled wrong. He picked up his pencil, wrote something, crossed it out, wrote again. "Do not want to." Clara leaned forward across the table. "Not cannot. You are able, but you choose not to." Long pause. His eyes dropped to the table, to his hands, to the scars that covered them like a map of violence. Then he spoke. One word. Rough as gravel, like a door that had not opened in years, like rust scraping against rust. "No." His voice was deep, deeper than she expected. Hoarse from disuse, but still strong beneath the roughness. Clara's heart stopped. He could speak. He simply chose not to. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked outside into the cold without his coat, without looking back. She sat alone with the weight of that single word, wondering what had happened to make a man seal his own voice away. What kind of pain could make silence feel safer than speaking? The next week, Evan took her into town for supplies. They needed flour and salt and coffee, and a dozen other things the ranch could not provide. Clara rode beside him on the wagon seat, closer than they had been since that first night, close enough to feel the warmth of his body through layers of wool and leather. The town looked different in daylight than it had that terrible night on the bench. Busier, more alive. People moving between buildings on errands and business. Horses tied to hitching posts. Children running through the streets playing games she did not recognize. Clara walked beside Evan down the main street of Bitter Creek, feeling eyes on her from every direction. The weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The abandoned bride. That is what they whispered when they thought she could not hear, shacking up with the silent rancher, probably warming his bed for room and board, probably no better than she ought to be. She kept her chin up, refused to look down, refused to let them see how much their words cut. A shopwoman's gaze traveled down Clara's frame with obvious distaste, lips pursing in that familiar judgment. That look that said she was too much, too big, too present, too unwilling to shrink herself into something more acceptable. Evan stepped closer to her, subtle, a shift of weight that put him between her and the judging eyes. Not possessive, not aggressive, just present, just there. She had not asked for his protection, but she noticed it, stored it away in the place where she kept the coat that fit and the words that did not judge and every other small kindness he had shown her without asking anything in return. While Evan loaded the wagon with supplies, Maggie appeared at Clara's elbow. The saloon owner had a way of materializing when you least expected her, like she could smell interesting stories from a mile away. "Come on inside, honey. I reckon we need to talk." Maggie pulled Clara into the back room of the saloon, a private space filled with crates and barrels and a small table with 2 chairs. She poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one across to Clara. "I see how you look at him. Curious, maybe more than curious." Clara started to deny it, to make excuses, to explain that it was nothing like what Maggie was implying. Maggie held up a hand. "Save it for someone who did not run a saloon for 20 years. I have seen every kind of love and lust and loneliness there is. What I see between you two is something else, something that might be worth nurturing." She paused, took a long drink of her whiskey. "But before you go falling for Evan McAllister, you ought to know who he was." Before he went silent. Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. Evan McAllister was the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories. They called him the Silent Death. Never spoke to his targets, not a single word. Just tracked them across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Captured them if they came quiet. Killed them if they resisted. 47 men brought in over 10 years. 12 killed. Never lost a bounty. Never failed to collect his fee. Clara's mouth went dry. The man who had fed her bread and coffee on that frozen bench. The man who taught her to shoot with patient hands and steady eyes. He was a killer, a professional one. 5 years ago, he was tracking a monster named Clayton Vance. Maggie's voice dropped low. Clayton was the worst kind of evil. Raped and murdered women across Wyoming and Montana. 15 that they know of, probably more that they never found. Evil in human skin, if ever there was such a thing. What happened? Clara barely recognized her own voice. Clayton found out Evan was tracking him. Decided to send a message. He got to Evan's wife first. Sarah was her name. Sweet girl. Never hurt anyone in her life. Clara felt ice spreading through her stomach, through her chest, into her heart. Evan tracked Clayton down. Killed him with his bare hands, they say. Saved Sarah from that cabin in the mountains. But she was broken. Something inside her just snapped from what Clayton did to her. 6 months later, she took her own life. Clara set down her glass. Her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. Evan was the last one to see her alive. He was begging her not to do it, calling her name over and over. But she pulled the trigger anyway while he watched. Maggie looked into her own whiskey, like she could see the past reflected there. He has not spoken more than a handful of words since. Thinks his voice is cursed somehow. Thinks everyone he talks to ends up dead. That is not how anything works. Clara protested. Grief does not make you responsible for other people's choices. Grief does not follow logic, honey. You should know that better than most. They rode home in silence as the sun set behind the mountains. The wagon creaking over frozen ruts. The sky turning gold and purple and then deep blue as stars began to emerge. Clara looked at Evan differently now. Not as a dangerous man who might hurt her. Not as a broken man who needed fixing. As a man who had failed to save the person he loved most and had been punishing himself ever since. who had sealed away his voice because the last words he spoke had not been enough to save her. She reached over and touched his hand, lightly, just a moment of contact, just enough to let him know she was there. He startled, looked at her with those storm-gray eyes full of surprise. "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything you have done for me, for the coat, for the lessons, for not asking questions I could not answer." He did not write anything, just nodded once. But he did not pull his hand away. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, thinking about Evan, about Sarah, about the weight of grief that could make a man forget how to speak. He was not the one who could not save her. He was the one who blamed himself when she could not save herself. She thought about her own running, her own guilt, the money she had stolen from her father, the man whose murder she had witnessed without reporting it, the desperate lies she had told to escape. Maybe they were not so different after all. She wondered what it would be like to stop running, to stop hiding, to stand in one place and face whatever was coming for her. She fell asleep before she found the answer. A Wyoming blizzard does not just freeze your body, it freezes time itself, trapping strangers together in close quarters until they are not strangers anymore. 3 weeks into her stay at Silent Creek Ranch, Clara was feeding the chickens when the sky changed. One moment she could see the mountains rising purple in the distance. The next moment the world was white, howling nothing. The storm came without warning. No gradual darkening of clouds, no slow building of wind. One heartbeat, everything was normal. The next heartbeat, she could not see her own hand in front of her face. Clara dropped the bucket of grain. The chickens scattered shrieking into wherever chickens hide from storms. The wind cut through her coat like 1,000 knives, cold so deep it burned, cold that stole the breath from her lungs and the feeling from her fingers and toes. She could not find the house, could not tell which direction was which. Everything looked the same. Everything was white chaos and screaming wind, and the certainty that she was going to die out here 10 feet from safety. Then arms wrapped around her. Evan, appearing out of the white like a ghost made solid, pulling her against his chest, shielding her with his body, half carrying her through the blind chaos while the wind tried to tear them apart. They stumbled through the front door and collapsed onto the floor. Snow crusted their clothes, their hair, every inch of exposed skin. The wind screamed outside like something alive and hungry. Fire, Clara managed through chattering teeth. He was already moving, feeding kindling to the coals that still glowed in the hearth, building the blaze with practiced hands until warmth began pushing back the deadly cold. They were trapped. Looking out the window showed nothing but white. The storm would not let up for days, maybe longer. Clara had heard stories about Wyoming blizzards that lasted a week, that buried houses up to the roof lines, that killed cattle by the hundreds. That first day passed in strange intimacy. Clara changed behind a blanket that Evan held up for her, his eyes carefully averted, looking at the wall like it held something fascinating. She appreciated the courtesy more than she could say. They sat at the small table, closer than before because there was nowhere else to be. The storm had compressed their world down to this single room, this fire, this table. 2 chairs pushed close together for warmth. Clara noticed things she had avoided noticing before. The way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the map of scars on his hands, how he always sat facing the door even when there was a blizzard outside and no one could possibly be coming. A hunter's habit worn into bone and muscle. He wrote on his paper. "Where are you really from?" Clara hesitated. The lie came easy because she had practiced it so many times. "New York." He looked at her. Looked through her, maybe. Those storm-gray eyes seeing something she thought she had hidden. He did not push, did not call her a liar even though they both knew she was. Just nodded and went back to tending the fire. The second day, the boundaries between them began to blur. Clara decided to teach him to make biscuits. She had been making biscuits since she was 8 years old. Her mother had taught her before the consumption took hold. The memory was bittersweet, but she held on to it like a talisman. The lesson was a disaster. Flour everywhere, on the table, on Evan's shirt, on his face where he had wiped his forehead with a flour-covered hand. He looked like a ghost, a very confused ghost who had never seen biscuit dough before in his life. Clara laughed, really laughed, from deep in her belly where real laughter lives. For the first time since Boston. For the first time since watching Victor's hands close around that man's throat. Evan stared at her laughing, his expression unreadable at first. Then something shifted. Something cracked in the stone wall he kept between himself and the world, like he had forgotten what laughter sounded like he was remembering something precious that he had lost. She reached up to brush flour from his cheek. Instinct. The same way she would have touched anyone. Then her hand froze on his face as she realized what she was doing. How close they were standing. How his breath had gone still. His hand rose, covered hers, pressed her palm against his cheek. They were inches apart, close enough that she could count the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that if either of them moved, they would be kissing. Evan. She whispered his name like a question. He pulled back, stepped away. The moment shattered like ice under a boot heel. He grabbed his paper with shaking hands and wrote, "Sorry. Do not apologize for something you do not regret." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her, those storm-gray eyes full of something she could not name. Longing, maybe. Fear, maybe. The complicated weight of wanting something you believe you do not deserve. He wrote again, his hand less steady than before. "Regret everything I want." Then he walked outside into the blizzard. Did not need to check the animals. They were safe in the barn. He just needed to leave. Needed cold and distance and the howling wind to drown out whatever was building between them. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, covered in flour, heart pounding, hands shaking, not sure if she wanted to follow him or let him go. By the third night, the temperature had dropped to deadly. The fire ate wood faster than they could spare. 2 blankets each were not enough. 3 blankets were not enough. Clara's teeth would not stop chattering no matter how close she huddled to the hearth. Evan gestured toward the blankets spread before the fire, then at himself, then at her. His meaning clear, even without words. Sleep here, by the fire, together. Or freeze. Clara hesitated, not because of danger. She trusted him not to hurt her, trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. She hesitated because of wanting. "I take up a lot of space," she heard herself say. "It will be cramped." "Good," he wrote. More warmth, simple, practical, accepting. Like her size was a feature, not a flaw. Like having more of her was a benefit, not a burden. They lay down together on blankets spread before the hearth, awkward at first, backs to each other, a careful distance maintained between their bodies. But cold has its own logic. Cold does not care about propriety or reputation or the complicated feelings growing between 2 broken people. By midnight, she was pressed against his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist, his heartbeat steady against her back. She had never been held like this, not by any man. She had assumed no one would want to hold her, that she was too big, too awkward, too much. But Evan held her like she was exactly the right size, like there was nowhere else he would rather be. "Do you ever miss talking?" she asked into the darkness, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence stretched between them, long enough that she thought he had fallen asleep. "Do you ever just want to say everything? Want to open your mouth and let all the words pour out? Every thought, every feeling, every secret you have been keeping locked inside?" She felt his breath catch, felt his arm tighten around her waist, felt the tension in his body that said he was listening, that her words had landed somewhere deep. But no answer came. Not in words, not in writing, just silence, and the crackling fire, and the wind screaming outside. Somehow that restraint meant more than speaking could have. It said he was fighting something, that the words were there trying to get out, that she mattered enough to make him want to break his silence. She fell asleep in his arms, the safest she had felt since childhood. Clara woke wrapped around him like a vine, gray light filtering through frosted windows. The storm finally quiet outside. His eyes were open. He had been awake for a while, watching her sleep with an expression that made her heart ache. Their gazes held, neither looking away, neither pretending they had not spent the night tangled together, neither willing to break the strange intimacy the blizzard had forced upon them. He did not move away. Neither did she. Finally, he disentangled himself, gently, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. He stood, went to the window, looked out at a world transformed by snow. "Need to check the animals," he wrote. Not looking at her, he left. Clara sat in blankets that smelled like him. Smoke and leather and that indefinable something that was just Evan. She did not know what she was feeling, only knew that something had changed between them, something that could not be unchanged. She caught her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall. For the first time in years, she did not flinch at what she saw. He had held her all night, had not complained about space, had not made her feel like she was too much or too big or too anything. Maybe she had been wrong about herself. Maybe the voice in her head that told her she was unlovable had been lying all along. A small shift. Not acceptance yet, not quite, but the beginning of questioning everything she had believed about her own worth. Every family has secrets. Some are buried in silence. Others are locked in drawers waiting to destroy everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The man in the three-piece suit looked as out of place in Bitter Creek as a rattlesnake in a church. His clothes were too fine, his shoes too polished, his manner too Eastern for this rough frontier town. But his eyes, when they swept the saloon, held the cold patience of something far more dangerous than any snake. The patience of a man who had killed before and would kill again without remorse. Victor Harrington had found her. Clara did not see him arrive. She learned about it from Maggie, who came riding hard to the ranch 3 days after the blizzard finally broke. Her horse was lathered. Her face was grim, Eastern man, expensive clothes, dead eyes like a shark. Maggie was breathing hard from the ride, looking for someone named Clara Ashford, offering $500 for information about her whereabouts, saying she is his fiancée, and she is mentally unwell, and he is just trying to help her. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands went cold. Her heart started pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "That is my real name," she heard herself say. "Clara Ashford, daughter of Judge Harrison Ashford of Boston, Massachusetts. Then you better start talking, honey, because that man has money, and money buys a lot of loyalty in a town this poor." Clara told her everything, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. The murder she had witnessed. Victor strangling Mr. Patterson in her father's study while she watched through the crack in the door. Victor's threats afterward. "Marry me as planned or no one will ever find your body." Her escape west. The false name. The mail-order bride advertisement. The desperate hope that had died with Samuel Thornton. Maggie listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with every word. When Clara finished, the older woman nodded once. "I did not see nothing," she said. "Do not know nobody by that name. Never heard of any Clara Ashford." She rode back to town to keep watch, to listen for any rumors about Clara's whereabouts, to be the eyes and ears they needed in enemy territory. Clara was alone when Evan returned from checking the fence lines that the blizzard had damaged. She told him everything, too. The whole ugly truth she had been hiding since the night he found her on that bench. He listened, face expressionless as stone. When she finished, she braced herself for rejection, for anger, for the inevitable moment when he decided she was more trouble than she was worth. "I understand if you want me to leave. I have brought danger to your door. This is not your fight." He pulled out his paper, wrote in that careful, unpracticed hand. "Where would you go?" "I do not know. Anywhere. I will figure something out. I always do." He wrote again. 2 words that changed everything. "No, stay. Why would you risk yourself for someone you barely know? Someone who lied to you. Someone who brought a murderer to your doorstep." He did not write, just looked at her. Those storm-gray eyes saying everything his voice would not. The answer was there in the space between them. In the memory of his arms around her during the blizzard. In the way he had held her like she was something worth protecting. Neither of them spoke the obvious truth out loud. Neither of them was ready for that yet. That evening, while Evan rode to town to gather information about Victor and his movements, Clara was alone in the house. Pacing, agitated, terrified, looking for something to do with her hands to keep from screaming. She went to put away blankets and found a compartment she had missed before, hidden in the wall behind the chest of drawers in Evan's room, a space that had been built deliberately to hide something. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, addressed to Evan in feminine handwriting. Never opened. The name at the bottom was Sarah. Clara knew she should not read it, knew it was not her secret to uncover. This was private grief, private pain, the kind of thing that belonged only to the person who had earned it. She read it anyway. Evan. "I asked you to kill Clayton Vance 6 months before he took me. I told you what he did to me the first time. How he found me alone on the road to town. How he dragged me into the woods. How he hurt me in ways I could never speak of to anyone but you. You said there was not enough evidence. You said the law had to handle it. You said you could not just kill a man without proof, even if I swore it was true. You chose the law over me. And then he came back. He took me again. He kept me for 3 days in that cabin while you searched. And this time you watched me break. You saved my body, Evan. But you let my soul die the day you refused to believe me. The day you told me to wait for the law to work. The law that did nothing. The law that let him walk free. I cannot live with what he did to me. The memories that will not stop. The feeling of his hands that I cannot wash away no matter how hard I scrub. But I also cannot live with knowing you heard me beg for help and did nothing. That you could have stopped this before it started if you had just believed me. If you had just listened. His blood is on your hands, Evan, and now so is mine. I am sorry. I love you, but I cannot stay. Sarah." Clara dropped the letter, her hands shaking so badly she could not have held it if she tried. She understood now. Everything made a terrible kind of sense. Evan's silence was not just grief for a dead wife. It was guilt. The crushing weight of knowing he could have prevented it all. That Sarah had begged him for help and he had chosen rules over faith, evidence over trust, the law over love. He had not just failed to save Sarah. He had failed to believe her. And that failure had cost everything. She was still holding the letter when the front door opened. Evan stood in the doorway, saw her face, saw what she held in her trembling hands. His expression went from neutral to devastated in the space of a single heartbeat. Like she had shot him. Like she had reached into his chest and torn out his heart. "She told you. Before," Clara's voice cracked. "She told you about Clayton and what he did, and you did not believe her. You did not protect her." He grabbed his paper, wrote with a hand that trembled as badly as hers. "She told me. I did not have proof. Could not just kill a man without... You could not just believe her? Your wife? The woman you loved? She told you she had been violated, and you asked for evidence?" He flinched like she had struck him. Like her words were fists landing against his face. Terrible silence stretched between them. The fire crackled, the wind whispered against the windows, and neither of them moved. "Is that why you do not speak?" Clara pressed forward even though she knew she was being cruel. Knew she was cutting him open. Because the last thing you said to her was some excuse about evidence and procedure and waiting for the law. Evan closed his eyes. pain radiating from every line of his body. From the set of his shoulders to the clench of his jaw to the white-knuckled fists at his sides, he wrote slowly, each word pulled from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he had kept locked away for 5 years. Last thing I said was, "Please do not do this." I was begging her, crying on my knees. She did it anyway, while I watched, while I tried to stop her, while I screamed her name. Clara's anger shattered, every ounce of righteous fury draining out of her like water from a cracked cup. She saw it clearly now, not a man who had not cared enough, not a monster who had ignored his wife's pain, a man who had cared too much about rules and too little about faith, a man who had spent 5 years destroying himself for a mistake he could never undo. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should not have read that. It was not mine to find." He shook his head, wrote slowly, "Needed to happen, could not hide it forever. Better you know who I am, what I failed to do." "Is that why you helped me?" Clara asked the question she had been afraid to ask. "Penance? Another woman you are trying to save because you could not save her?" He looked up, eyes wet with tears he was too proud to let fall. "At first," he wrote. "Maybe. Yes. I saw you on that bench and I saw her. Saw someone running from something terrible. Saw someone who needed help." Clara nodded, turned away. Of course. She was just another chance at redemption, another broken woman to fix, another way for him to prove he was not the man who had failed Sarah. He grabbed her arm, spun her back around to face him, and then he spoke. His voice shattered, barely a rasp, like gravel and broken glass. But he spoke. Not anymore. "What?" Clara stared at him. "Not penance. Not anymore. Not for weeks now. You are not her. You are not Sarah. You are not a ghost I am trying to save. Then what am I?" Long pause. His hand still on her arm. His breath unsteady. His eyes searching her face for something only he could see. "You are the reason I want to speak again. The reason I want to stop punishing myself. The reason I wake up in the morning instead of lying in bed wishing I was dead." He kissed her, not gentle, not sweet, not the careful kiss of new lovers testing the waters. Desperate. 5 years of silence pouring into contact. 5 years of grief and guilt and loneliness breaking against the shore of her lips. She kissed him back, equally desperate, equally hungry. All the fear and loneliness and self-hatred she had carried since Boston dissolving in the heat of his mouth against hers. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, hands clutching each other like drowning people finding solid ground. "I am still not leaving," Clara said. Evan's voice was barely there, rough as unworked stone, but present, alive. "I know, I am not asking you to." They came at dawn. 4 riders spreading across the valley like wolves circling prey, moving with the coordinated purpose of men who had hunted together before. Clara saw them from the bedroom window where she had been watching the sunrise. She had not been able to sleep. Too many thoughts swirling through her head, the kiss, Victor in town, the danger closing in from all sides. The riders changed everything. She woke Evan, shook him from the light sleep he had been pretending was rest, showed him the men fanning out across the valley floor. He watched for 3 seconds, assessing, calculating, the bounty hunter emerging from whatever grave he had buried it in. "Grab essentials," he wrote fast. 2 minutes. We ride. Clara did not argue, did not ask questions. She trusted him with her life now, had made that decision somewhere between the blizzard and the kiss. They slipped out the back door into the pre-dawn darkness. The horses were already saddled. Evan's morning routine. Always ready to run at a moment's notice. The habit of a man who had spent years tracking dangerous men and being tracked in return. He led them into the foothills on trails Clara would never have found alone. Narrow paths through rocky terrain, frozen streams that they walked through to hide their tracks, treacherous slopes where one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into the darkness below. Clara rode hard, keeping up, her solid build helping her stay seated when her horse stumbled on ice or scrambled over rocks. The riding lessons she had resented as a girl paying off now when it mattered most. Behind them they heard shouts. The riders had found the ranch empty, had realized their prey had slipped the trap. The pursuit began in earnest. Evan pushed the horses as fast as safety would allow, up ridges thick with pine, through forests where branches clawed at their faces, across a frozen creek that cracked ominously beneath the weight of horse and rider. They rode through the morning, through the afternoon, through the fading light of evening, until the horses were lathered with sweat, and Clara could barely stay in the saddle, until every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Finally, Evan stopped at a tiny structure tucked into a mountain hollow. Barely a cabin. One room with a stone fireplace and a single narrow bed. A line shack from his ranching days. Emergency shelter for cowboys caught in bad weather. "How long can we stay?" Clara asked as she slid from her exhausted horse. He wrote by the dying light. "Day, maybe 2. They will find the trail eventually. Men like that always do. And then what? Then we go back. And we end this. End it how?" He did not answer. But she saw it in his eyes. The cold calculation of a hunter becoming the hunted. The bounty hunter waking up. The silent death remembering what he was capable of. That night they lay together in the narrow bed. No pretense of propriety, no room for it. The bed was barely wide enough for one person, let alone 2. "After the storm you pulled away," Clara said into the darkness. "Why?" Evan spoke slowly, his voice still rough but growing stronger with use, like a muscle being exercised after years of neglect. "Because I wanted to pull closer, wanted to hold you, kiss you, more than I have wanted anything since Sarah died. And that felt wrong." "Wrong how?" "Sarah. Only been 5 years. Still felt like yesterday most days. Like I was betraying her by wanting someone else. And now—" Long pause. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "Now I think Sarah would want me to live. Actually live. Not just exist. Not just go through the motions until my body catches up with what my heart already feels." "What does your heart feel?" "Dead." For a long time, he paused. "Less dead now. Because of you." Clara turned to face him in the narrow bed. Their noses nearly touching. She could feel his breath warm against her lips. "What do you want, Evan? Right now? If you could have anything. This." His other hand rose to touch her face. Gentle, reverent. "You. A future. Something worth protecting. Something worth fighting for." They did not make love. Not here. Not while running for their lives. That was for later. For when they had survived whatever was coming. But they held each other with intention, with understanding of what they were building, with the fierce tenderness of 2 broken people who had found something worth mending. By morning, Clara had made her decision. "We cannot keep running." She said it as statement, not question. "I know. If we go back, they will come for us. Victor. Whoever he has allied with, all of them at once. Yes. Then we make them come to us. On our terms, in a place of our choosing." Evan stood, started packing what little they had brought, his movements efficient, purposeful. A man preparing for war. "I used to hunt men for a living." His voice was stronger now, more sure. Time to remember how. Dalton Vance walked into Victor Harrington's hotel room and recognized a kindred spirit immediately. Not by his expensive clothes or his Eastern manners or his polished shoes, by the complete absence of anything human behind his eyes. Victor had eyes like a dead fish, cold and flat and empty. The eyes of a man who had killed before and felt nothing, who would kill again without hesitation if it served his purpose. Vance knew those eyes, saw them every morning in his shaving mirror. "You want the woman," Vance said without preamble. Victor studied him with that dead fish stare. "What do you propose?" "Evan McAllister killed my brother Clayton 5 years ago. Tracked him across 3 territories and put a knife through his heart. I have been waiting ever since for a chance at revenge. The bounty hunter." Victor's lip curled in distaste. "I have heard stories. The Silent Death, they called him. Never spoke to his targets before he brought them in. He is not a bounty hunter anymore, just a broken man living on a dying ranch, drinking himself to sleep every night and waiting for death to find him. But now he has something to lose again. The woman. The woman." They shook hands. 2 predators agreeing to share a kill. 2 monsters recognizing each other across the space between them. Victor provides money. Pinkerton detectives, hired muscle from back east. Vance provides local knowledge. His own men. The sheriff in his pocket. Together they would crush Evan McAllister and take what they wanted from the ashes. Clara and Evan had returned from the mountains 2 days after fleeing. They were staying at Maggie's saloon while they prepared, while they gathered allies, while they planned their defense. Victor stepped onto the hotel balcony the morning after they arrived. His voice carried across the main street of Bitter Creek, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Clara Ashford, I know you are here. I know you are hiding behind a man who cannot protect you. You have 5 days to come to me willingly. After that, I will take you by force. Anyone who shelters you will suffer the consequences." Clara watched from Maggie's window. Evan stood beside her, stone-faced, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. The countdown had begun. They spent the next 3 days gathering allies. Evan going door to door with his paper and pencil, explaining the situation without speaking, asking for help against men who had terrorized this valley for years. Doc Brennan agreed immediately. He was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and steady hands. He had known Sarah, had helped Evan through the worst of his grief, had stitched up more gunshot wounds than he cared to remember. "Vance has been a cancer on this valley for too long," Doc said. "Time someone cut it out." The Quinns agreed. Tom and his wife Elizabeth, hard people made harder by loss. Vance's men had killed their only son in a dispute over water rights last year. Called it self-defense. Everyone knew it was murder. "We have been waiting for a chance to make him pay," Tom said. "Count us in." A young rancher named Jack Holloway agreed enthusiastically. Too enthusiastically, Clara thought. Something about his smile that did not reach his eyes. Something about the way he agreed to everything without asking questions, but they needed every gun they could get, so she kept her suspicions to herself. Maggie volunteered without being asked, pulled a shotgun from behind the bar and checked that it was loaded. "I have been looking for an excuse to use this," she said with a grim smile. 7 people. Against Vance's men. Against Victor's hired Pinkertons. Against whatever mercenaries money could buy. Not nearly enough. But it was what they had. That night, Evan withdrew. Would not look at Clara. Would not write to her. Silent, in a different way than before, a darker way, a darker. She found him in Maggie's back room, staring at nothing, his hands clenched into fists. "Talk to me. Something is wrong. Everyone I get close to dies." His voice was raw, scraped clean of everything but pain, or they get hurt. "Sarah. Thornton. He died because Vance wanted to trap me. Used him as bait. If you stay with me, you will be next. Evan. I cannot watch you die like I watched her. Cannot hear you beg me to help while I am powerless to do anything. Cannot live through that again." Clara grabbed his face with both hands, forced him to look at her, to see the woman who had chosen to stand beside him despite everything. "I am not Sarah. I will not break the same way she did. I am stronger than I look. You do not know that. You are right. I do not. But you do not get to decide what risks I am willing to take. That is my choice, my life, my decision. Long silence, his breath unsteady, his eyes wet. I know you are not Sarah, he whispered. That is why I am more scared than I have ever been, because losing you would destroy me in ways losing her did not. She held him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders and pulled him close. Let him shake. Let him break. Let him be weak for once in his life. He let her. Neither of them saw Jack Holloway slip out the back door of the saloon. Neither saw him meet one of Vance's men at the edge of town. Neither saw him hand over a note containing everything they had planned. "Tell Vance I delivered," Jack said, his voice tight with fear and self-loathing. "We are square on my debts now." "Right," the man nodded, took the note, rode away into the darkness. Jack walked back to town, hating himself, too afraid of what Vance would do to his family if he refused. Too weak to choose honor over safety. Too weak to be anything but what he was, a traitor. They came at 3 in the morning, the hour of wolves and cowards, the hour when darkness is deepest and hope is thinnest, the hour when even the bravest men are uncertain and the weakest are paralyzed with fear. Clara woke to gunfire. Glass shattered inward, spraying the room with fragments. Wood splintered as bullets tore through the walls. The world became chaos in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Evan was already up, already moving, rifle in hand, returning fire from a window with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before. Many times before. Down. His voice rang clear, commanding, sharp, the voice of the silent death emerging from 5 years of silence. The bounty hunter was back. Clara dropped flat against the floor, glass cutting her hands. She grabbed the pistol from under her pillow. He had taught her to keep it there, always loaded, always ready. Chaos swirled around her. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, bullets punching through walls, the screaming of horses in the street, the shouting of men trying to coordinate an attack against targets who were fighting back. At least 8 attackers, maybe more, coming from all sides. Someone had told them the defensive positions. Someone had betrayed them. Clara crawled to the back window, broken glass grinding into her knees. She raised herself just enough to see, to aim, to pull the trigger. She hit one man, saw him drop with a scream, saw the dark bloom of blood on his chest. First time she had shot a person. No time to process it. No time to feel the weight of taking a human life. Only time to duck back down as return fire tore through the window frame above her head. Evan took out 2 more, his rifle cracking in steady rhythm, each shot finding its mark, each shot dropping an enemy. But they kept coming. Outside, Maggie and the Quinns were supposed to flank the attackers from the east, cut off their retreat, catch them in crossfire. But the attackers knew, had positioned men to cut off the flanking route, had prepared for exactly the tactics the defenders had planned. Maggie realized what had happened, the cold certainty of betrayal settling into her gut. Someone had talked. Someone in their group had sold them out. She saw Jack Holloway, not fighting, not helping, slipping toward the back of the property, slipping toward a gate that would let more of Vance's men through. She followed him, moving quiet through the shadows, her shotgun heavy in her hands, found him opening the gate, his hands shaking, his face pale in the moonlight. "Jack." Her voice was ice, cold and sharp and deadly. He spun, saw her shotgun aimed at his chest, saw death looking back at him from her eyes. "Maggie, I can explain," he stammered. "Please, let me explain. Save it. He had my debts," his voice cracking with desperation. "My family's land, everything we have. I did not have a choice. There is always a choice." He reached for his gun, fear making him stupid, making him forget who she was, what she had done to survive in this hard country. She shot him. No dramatic speech, no lengthy death scene, no final words or redemption or forgiveness. Just a betrayer getting what betrayers get. A body crumpling to the ground, a gate staying closed. Maggie stepped over him, closed the latch, returned to the fight. Her face would tell the story later. The story of a woman who had started to care for a man who turned out to be something less than human. But that was for later. For now, there was only the fight. Back in the building, the attack was failing. The defenders had held longer than anyone expected, had killed or wounded more attackers than Vance and Victor had planned for. Then one of Vance's men breached through a side window, a big man with a scarred face and murder in his eyes. Evan spun to shoot him, his rifle cracking, the big man falling. But another attacker was hidden in the shadows behind the first. A backup, a contingency. He fired before Evan could turn. The bullet took Evan in the shoulder, spun him around, dropped him to the floor. Clara screamed his name, a sound torn from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond thought or reason. She shot the second attacker. 3 rounds, 2 finding their mark. He fell and did not move again. She crawled to Evan. Blood everywhere. So much blood, spreading across the floor, soaking through his shirt. Evan, stay with me, please. You cannot leave me. His eyes were open but unfocused, shock setting in, blood loss making everything fuzzy. Get out, he managed. Run. I am not leaving you, I am not. I am not. The gunfire outside was dying down. Someone was shouting orders, organizing a final assault. Clara realized the terrible truth. They were regrouping, coming inside to finish the job. The front door crashed open. Victor Harrington stood in the doorway, 2 men flanking him, his dead fish eyes surveying the carnage with no more emotion than a man examining a business ledger. Hello, Clara. His voice was calm, reasonable, terrifying. I told you I would come for you. She raised her gun, pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. Victor's men grabbed her, pinned her arms behind her back, held her while Victor walked slowly across the room. He stopped beside Evan's prone body, looked down at the wounded man with something like contempt. The famous, silent death. Victor's lip curled. Not much of a threat now, is he? Just another frontier animal bleeding out on a saloon floor. Clara struggled against the men holding her. I will kill you. I swear to God I will kill you. You will do nothing of the kind. Victor turned to face her, grabbed her hair, dragged her upright. You are coming with me tonight, Clara. Back to Boston. Back to the life you were born into. And this, he gestured at Evan, this dies here. I will have my men put a bullet in his head before we leave. No, please, take me. I will go willingly. I will marry you. I will do whatever you want. Just do not hurt him. Begging. Victor smiled, that terrible calm smile. That is more like it. I always knew you would beg eventually. He started dragging her toward the door, his men following. His attention focused entirely on his prize. Everyone thought Evan was unconscious, thought the blood loss had taken him too far to fight back. Everyone was wrong. He had been reaching for his boot, slowly, carefully, the knife he always kept there. The blade that had killed Clayton Vance 5 years ago. The blade that had ended more lives than he could count. He could barely move, everything swimming in and out of focus, the world tilting and spinning. But he could see Victor dragging Clara toward the door, could see the terror on her face, could see everything he had found in the past 2 months about to be taken from him. Something inside him unlocked, something cold and deadly that he had kept chained for 5 years. The silent death woke up. He moved, fast, silent, like he used to, before Sarah, before grief, before he forgot what he was capable of. First guard, the one on the left, knife slipping between ribs and into kidney, down without a sound, dead before he knew he was dying. Second guard turning, eyes going wide, hand reaching for his gun, too slow, much too slow. Evan tackled him, knife finding the throat, the soft spot where blade slides through flesh like butter, blood spraying hot across his hands. Victor dropped Clara, went for his own gun, his dead eyes suddenly alive with something like fear. Evan was already on him, but too weak, too slow. Blood loss making his movements sluggish. The knife missing its mark. Victor pistol whipped him, the gun barrel cracking against his skull. Evan went down, stayed down. Victor aimed at Evan's head, his hand steady despite everything, his voice calm. Should have stayed down, cowboy. Clara grabbed the fallen guard's gun. She did not hesitate, did not warn, did not give him a chance to surrender or explain or beg for the mercy he would never have shown. 3 shots. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. Victor Harrington dropped, dead before he hit the floor. Clara stood over his body, the gun still raised, her ears ringing, her hands shaking. Blood spattered across her dress. Evan dragged himself upright against the wall, blood soaking through his shirt, his face pale as death itself. Their eyes met across the carnage, across the bodies, across everything that had brought them to this moment. You, he breathed, saved me. Clara looked at the blood on her hands, at the man she had just killed, at the line she had crossed that could never be uncrossed. Now we are even. Victor's blood was still warm on Clara's hands when the second threat emerged from the darkness. You think this is over? Dalton Vance stepped through the ruined doorway, his boots crunching on broken glass, his gun drawn, his weathered face twisted with rage. Victor was just the hired help. I am the one you should have feared all along. Clara aimed her gun at him, pulled the trigger. Click, empty. She had used the last bullet, putting Victor down. Vance smiled. The smile of a predator who has cornered wounded prey. Counted the shots, did you not, sweetheart? 3 into Victor. None left for me. He walked toward her slowly, savoring every step, every moment of her fear. 5 years, he said. 5 years I have watched McAllister rot on this ranch. Watched him drink himself half to death every night. Watched him wait for someone to put him out of his misery. I was going to be that someone. Eventually, when the time was right. He stopped a few feet from where Clara stood. His gun held loose at his side, not even bothering to aim. That is how confident he was. And then you came along. He gestured at her with the gun barrel. The first thing he has cared about in all those years. The perfect way to make him suffer. Clayton was a monster. Clara's voice came out steady despite her terror. You know what he did, what he was. Clayton was my brother. Vance's voice went cold. I do not care what he did. I do not care how many women he hurt. He was blood, family, and that trumps everything else. He backhanded her, the blow catching her across the cheek, spinning her around, dropping her to the floor beside Evan. Vance walked to where Evan slumped against the wall, looked down at the wounded man with something like triumph. Oh, the silent death has something to say. Go ahead, say it. I want to hear your voice before I kill you. Evan looked up at him, blood running down his face, pain in every line of his body. But his eyes were clear, focused. Go to hell. Vance laughed, pressed his boot into Evan's wounded shoulder. Evan screamed, the sound torn from him against his will, raw and agonized. That is more like it. Vance ground his heel in deeper. I want to hear you beg, like Clayton begged when you had your knife at his throat. I want you to know what it feels like. I will not beg. Evan's voice shook with pain. Not for you. Not for him. Kill me if you are going to, but I will not beg. Vance cocked his gun, pressed the barrel against Evan's forehead. Then you will die silent, just like you lived, a gunshot. But not from Vance's gun. From outside, the window shattering inward, glass spraying across the room. Drop the weapon, Vance. Doc Brennan's voice. Then Maggie's, then the Quinns, then others Clara did not recognize. They were surrounded, more ranchers than before. Word had spread after the attack started. More people had come, people who had been afraid of Vance for years, people who had finally found the courage to stand up. "This is not over," Vance snarled. "It is tonight." Maggie stepped through the door, her shotgun aimed at his chest. "Down, now." Vance looked around, counted the guns pointed at him, did the math that only leads to one conclusion. He dropped his weapon, raised his hands. His men were dead or fled. His ally was dead on the floor. His plan was in ruins around him. It was over. Dawn came slowly over the mountains, pink and gold and peaceful, the violence of the night fading like a bad dream. Doc Brennan worked on Evan's shoulder. The bullet had passed clean through, serious but survivable if infection did not set in. Doc had seen worse, much worse. The sheriff arrived, too late as always. But this time there was evidence he could not ignore. Victor's letters to Vance, found on Victor's body, detailing their partnership, their plans, the money exchanged, the men hired, Jack's confession note. Maggie had taken it from his pocket, written in his own hand, detailing everything Vance had made him do. Too many witnesses, too many respectable citizens willing to testify. Too much proof for even a bought sheriff to dismiss. Vance was arrested. Murder of Samuel Thornton. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. Half a dozen other charges that would keep lawyers busy for months. As they dragged him toward the wagon that would take him to the territorial jail, Vance shouted at Evan, "This is not done. I will get out. I will find you. I will—" Evan stood with Clara's help, bleeding but upright, his voice hoarse but clear. Clayton deserved to die. He was a monster, evil in human skin. You spent 5 years avenging a monster. What does that make you? Vance had no answer. Could not find words for the simple truth Evan had spoken. They loaded him into the wagon and drove him away. Later, after the bodies had been removed, after the blood had been scrubbed from the floors, after the broken windows had been boarded up. Clara sat alone in Maggie's back room, staring at her hands. Victor's blood had been washed away hours ago. But she could still feel it, still see it, still smell the copper tang of it. She had killed someone, taken a human life, crossed a line she could never uncross. Evan found her, sat beside her on the narrow bench, his shoulder bandaged. His face pale, but alive, here, with her. "I killed someone," she said. "You saved us." "I know. But I thought I would feel something. Guilt. Horror. Something that told me I was still human. What do you feel?" Long pause, searching inside herself for the answer. Relief. And that scares me. Relief that he is dead, that he can never hurt anyone again, that I am free. Evan took her hands, raised them to his lips, kissed her knuckles one by one. "I have killed men. Some in justice, some in anger. The ones I killed in justice I never lost sleep over. The ones I killed protecting the innocent. The ones who would have killed others if I had not stopped them. Does that make us bad people? It makes us survivors. There is a difference." Clara leaned into him, rested her head on his good shoulder. Let herself breathe for the first time in hours. She was a killer now, just like him. But she was alive, and he was alive, and that was enough. Some stories end with, and they lived happily ever after. This one ends with something more true, something more real. And they chose each other. Every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, until the end. 2 weeks passed, the shoulder healed, the bruises faded, the broken windows were repaired. Life went on the way life always does. Stubbornly, relentlessly, despite everything that tries to stop it. Evan could lift his arm above his head again, could smile when Clara walked into a room. Small things that used to be impossible. Small miracles that proved he was still alive. Visitors came to the ranch, neighbors, townspeople. People who had ignored Clara on that bench 2 months ago. bringing food and offering help and expressing gratitude for what she and Evan had done. Some of them apologized. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had refused to join the fight. I was wrong. I was a coward. I am sorry. Clara accepted the apology. Community mattered now. Forgiveness mattered. Building something better than what had come before. Samuel Thornton's sister Ruth came. A quiet woman with kind eyes. She brought a small silver ring. Samuel was going to give this to you, she said. He wrote to me about you. Said you seemed kind. Said he hoped you would be happy together. Clara's eyes filled with tears. He did not abandon me. No. He was murdered by Vance. To trap Mr. McAllister. To use you as bait. You were never abandoned, Clara. Never rejected. Just used by evil men for evil purposes. That truth settled into Clara like rain into dry soil. She had not been found wanting. Had not been rejected for being too much. Had been used as a pawn in a game she did not understand. There was a difference. A profound one. That evening, Clara stood before the small mirror in her bedroom. Old habit kicking in. Critical eye cataloging flaws. Too tall, too wide, too much of everything. But then she remembered. Evan calling her build an advantage. A stable base. Something to be used, not hidden. His hands on her waist with no hesitation, no disgust, no pulling away. I like looking at you. He had said it just that morning. Simple, direct, true. She looked at herself differently now. Not trying to see what Evan saw. Trying to see what was actually there. Strong shoulders that had carried her through 2 months of hardship. Capable hands that had fired a gun and saved a man's life. A body that had survived blizzards and gunfights, and the worst a cruel world could throw at it. Maybe she had been wrong about herself all along. Maybe the voice in her head had been lying. Maybe she was exactly the right size after all. That night they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The comfortable silence of two people who had stopped needing words to communicate. Then, without preamble, Evan spoke. Marry me. Clara nearly dropped her coffee. What? Marry me. He was looking at the mountains, not at her, like he was afraid to see her face when she answered. I have spoken more in the past month than I did in the 5 years before you came. All because of you. All because you saw something in me worth saving. I want to keep speaking. With you. To you. For the rest of my life. Clara set down her coffee. Looked at this man. Scarred and broken and mended. Silent for so long and finding his voice again. Because of her. For her. That might be the worst proposal I have ever heard. His jaw tightened. I know. Will you anyway? She kissed him, long and deep and full of everything she felt but could not say, when she pulled back. Yes, obviously yes. You impossible man. The wedding was small, held at Maggie's saloon 1 week later. No reason to wait. They had waited long enough. Life was short and uncertain, and they both knew it could end at any moment. Clara wore a simple white dress that Maggie had sewn. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. Just clean and beautiful and perfect for a frontier wedding. Evan wore his cleanest shirt, still favoring his shoulder, still healing, but standing tall, standing proud. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony. A weathered old man who had married hundreds of couples and buried most of them. Evan spoke his vows aloud, each word deliberate, each word chosen with care. I am still learning to speak again, the words coming slow but steady. But I want you to know, you are the reason I am trying. You gave me something worth talking about, something worth living for. I promised to spend the rest of my days proving I was worth the chance you took. Clara spoke hers. I came west running from everything, my past, my fear, myself. I thought I was looking for a place to hide. Instead, I found a home. I found you, and I am done running. I promise to stand beside you for as long as we both live." They exchanged rings, Samuel's ring on her finger, a gift from a man she never met. Evan's mother's ring on his. Doc had kept it safe for 5 years, waiting for this moment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled. "You may kiss the bride." They kissed. Maggie cried. Doc pretended he had allergies. That night, Evan carried Clara over the threshold of the ranch house. She laughed and protested that he would hurt his shoulder. He told her it was worth it. The house was the same, but everything was different now. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Boston. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. "Mrs. McAllister, I am writing with information you deserve to know. My brother Victor was a monster. I know this because I lived in the same house with him for 20 years, because I saw what he did when he thought no one was watching. After his death, I gained access to his private papers. What I found horrified me. Victor did not just witness your father asking questions about your disappearance. He silenced him permanently. Your father's stroke was not natural. Victor poisoned him slowly over 3 weeks. I have enclosed the relevant documents, proof of what he did. Do with them what you will. Justice for my brother's crimes has already been served by your hand. I only thought you should know the full extent of what he was. I am sorry for what my family has done to yours. Victoria Harrington." Clara dropped the letter, hands shaking. Victor had killed her father, and she had killed Victor. She had not known she was getting revenge, but she had been. Some kind of cosmic justice that she had never asked for. Evan found her crying, held her while she shook. "I do not know what to feel," she said. "You feel whatever you feel. No right or wrong. Is it terrible that part of me is satisfied? That part of me is glad I killed the man who murdered my father? No. It is human. It is honest." She burned the letter eventually. No need for more pain. No need for evidence that would only cause more suffering. Her father was gone. Victor was gone. And she was alive. That would have to be enough. News arrived a month later. Dalton Vance found guilty by territorial court. Murder of Samuel Thornton. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. A dozen other charges. Sentenced to life imprisonment at the Wyoming Territorial Penitentiary in Laramie. No parole. No possibility of release. Evan heard the news. Nodded once. "It is done," he said. "Does it feel like enough?" "It feels like over. That is enough." 2 years passed. Spring came to the valley. The snow melting, the sage showing green, wildflowers blooming across the meadows, life returning the way it always did. Clara and Evan brought their daughter to town for the first time. Little Sarah, named for the woman Evan had lost. 2 years old with her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. As they passed the station, Clara stopped. She looked at the bench where she had slept in the cold, where she had given up, where she had decided that if no one came by sunrise, she would walk into the snow and not come back. "What is wrong, Mama?" little Sarah asked. "Nothing, sweetheart. Mama is just remembering." She knelt beside the bench, touched the worn wood, remembered the woman she had been. Desperate, hopeless, waiting to die. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had survived. Evan stood beside her, their daughter in his arms. That night, Clara said quietly, "I had given up completely. I was going to let myself freeze, let it all be over." He went still. "I know," he said softly. "How did you know?" "Because I had the same look. After Sarah, that look that says you are done fighting, that you are ready for it to end." He touched her face with his free hand. "That is why I stopped. That is why I gave you my coat and asked you to come with me. Because I recognized myself in you. You saved me." He shook his head. "No. I gave you a coat and asked if you wanted to come with me. You are the one who stood up. You are the one who chose to live." That was all you. Clara looked at their daughter, at this man who had found her at her lowest, at the life they had built together from the wreckage of their pasts. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for letting me." That evening, little Sarah was being put to bed, tucked into the small bed that had once been Clara's, in the room that was now a nursery. "Papa, tell me again how you met Mama." Evan sat on the edge of her bed, smiled, a real smile, easy now, not rare like it used to be. Mama was sleeping on a bench at the train station. She looked cold, so I gave her my coat. And then what happened? I wrote her a note. What did it say? "Come with me." And what did Mama say? Clara appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene, at her husband telling their daughter the story that had become family legend. Mama said yes. Evan looked at her over their daughter's head. All the words he could not say for 5 years were in that look. All the words she never thought she would deserve to hear. Later that night, Clara stood at the window watching stars emerge over the mountains. The same stars that had been there that first night, when she was a stranger in a wagon rolling toward an uncertain future. Evan's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "Happy," he murmured. "More than I ever knew how to be." Outside, the Wyoming wind still blew cold and vast. The mountains still rose dark against the sky. The land was still wild and dangerous and beautiful. But inside, the fire burned warm. Little Sarah slept peaceful in her bed, and the house that had been empty for so long was finally completely full. Some people come west looking for gold. Others come chasing land or freedom or a fresh start where nobody knows their name. Clara came because she had nowhere else to go, and she found everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and edited to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.